The moment the bus doors hissed open and he stepped onto the cracked pavement with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder, father felt the war still clinging to him, not in the form of medals or parades, but in the way his hands trembled slightly and his chest tightened to sudden sounds. And as he stood there in the quiet of his old neighborhood, he realized this return was harder than any battlefield moment because no one was waiting, no flags waving, just rows of familiar houses that now felt strangely distant. And as he walked toward the small weathered home where his daughter slept inside, unaware that her father had finally come back alive, his neighbor stepped out onto her porch and spoke one simple sentence that stopped him cold and shattered the armor he had built to survive. A sentence so ordinary and yet so devastating that it cut through years of silence, sacrifice, and suppressed pain, because she looked at him with steady eyes and said, "You can rest now. She is safe." And in that instant his knees nearly gave way as the weight of everything he had carried since leaving for war came crashing down, because no one had told him that before. Not his commanders, not the letters filled with forced optimism, not even himself. And as memories flooded back of nights spent staring at the ceiling wondering if his daughter would remember his face, of choosing duty over bedtime stories and birthday candles, of surviving explosions and loss only to feel empty inside, he realized that surviving was not the same as coming home. And the neighbor, a woman he barely knew beyond polite waves and borrowed tools, saw something in him that others missed: the exhaustion behind his posture and the grief buried under discipline. And she did not ask questions or demand explanations. She simply invited him to sit, to breathe, to exist without being on guard. And as they talked quietly on that porch, while dusk settled in, he learned that she had watched over his house during the years he was gone, collected mail, fixed broken steps, checked on his daughter with the help of family, not out of obligation but out of shared humanity. And hearing this both humbled and unraveled him, because while he had been fighting far away, believing he was alone in protecting his child's future, someone nearby had been standing watch in a quieter way. And when he finally went inside and saw his daughter asleep, clutching the old photo of him in uniform, something inside him shifted, because for the first time he allowed himself to feel not just pride in service, but grief for what it cost. And over the following days, as he struggled with the transition back to ordinary life, startled by fireworks, uneasy in crowds, of how to be fully present without scanning for danger, it was that neighbor who continued to offer steady, wordless support, reminding him through small acts that healing did not require strength all the time. And slowly, as he learned to cook breakfast without checking exits and to sit through a school play without flinching, he realized that the sentence she spoke that first night had planted a truth he desperately needed: that his worth was not only measured by what he endured in war, but by the love he carried home. And when his daughter finally asked him why he sometimes stared out the window with tears in his eyes, he told her the truth, in the simplest way he could, that coming home was harder than leaving, but staying was the bravest thing he would ever do. And years later, long after the uniform was folded away and the scars faded into memory, he would remember that his life did not change because of a battle or a medal, but because one person saw him not as a soldier or a hero, but as a tired father who needed permission to rest. And that single sentence, spoken on an ordinary porch, became the moment he stopped surviving and started living again. A quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful homecomings are not marked by noise or celebration, but by compassion spoken at exactly the right time. In the weeks that followed, the quiet rhythms of civilian life pressed against him in ways that felt unfamiliar and heavy, because while the war had taught him how to react, it had not taught him how to belong. And each morning he woke before dawn out of habit, sitting at the kitchen table listening to the house breathe, wondering how to fill the long hours, now that survival was no longer the only objective. And it was during one of those early mornings that he noticed the neighbor again, already awake, tending her small garden with deliberate care. And something about the patience of her movements stirred a restlessness in him, because patience had been a luxury he could not afford overseas. And when she invited him to walk with her, not to talk but simply to move, he resisted at first, feeling exposed without a mission. Yet he followed anyway, and as they walked the familiar streets he had once run through as a boy, she spoke gently about ordinary things, about weather and repairs, and a way time reshapes neighborhoods, never prying into his memories, never asking him to perform gratitude or strength. And that restraint allowed him to breathe more deeply than he had in years, because it made space for him to choose when to speak. And when he finally did, the words came out uneven and raw about the nights he replayed, decisions he could not undo, about the guilt of surviving when others did not, about the fear that he had returned, changed in ways his daughter might one day notice. And instead of offering comfort that felt rehearsed, the neighbor listened with a stillness that honored the weight of his truth. And she told him something else then, something quieter than the first sentence, yet just as powerful. That healing did not erase the past. It taught you how to carry it without letting it crush you, and those words stayed with him as he faced new challenges, like the first parent-teacher meeting, where he felt unqualified to speak about routines he was still learning, or the first time his daughter woke from a nightmare and reached for him with a trust that terrified and healed him all at once. And each moment tested whether he could stay present instead of retreating into the armor that once kept him alive. And slowly, through missed steps and small victories, he began to understand that returning from war was not a single event, but a series of choices, each one asking whether he would hide behind silence or lean into connection. And with every conversation on that porch, every shared meal, every ordinary kindness exchanged without expectation, the neighbor became a bridge between who he was and who he was becoming, not as a savior or a solution, but as a reminder that even the deepest wounds respond to patience. And though he did not yet know how his story would settle, he sensed that something irreversible had already begun, because the life waiting for him now demanded courage of a different kind, the courage to stay. And it was in an unremarkable moment months later that he finally understood the full weight of that first sentence spoken on the porch, because one evening after helping his daughter with homework, he found her asleep at the table, her head resting on her folded arms, utterly safe and unafraid. And as he carried her to bed, he felt a calm settle into his chest that no victory overseas had ever given him, a calm built not on alertness or survival, but on presence. And as he tucked her in, she stirred just enough to whisper his name with complete certainty that he was there and staying. And something inside him finally loosened, because he realized that this was the life he had been fighting for without fully knowing it, not the absence of danger, but the presence of love. And later that night, as he sat alone on the porch, the same porch where everything began, the neighbor joined him without a word, and together they watched the streetlights hum and the world slowed down. And he told her quietly that he still carried the war inside him, that some days were heavier than others. And she nodded and told him that carrying something did not mean it had to control where you walked. And in that moment he understood that healing was not a straight line or a finish point, but a relationship one built on patience, honesty, and the courage to accept help. And over time, he returned to work, volunteered with other veterans, learned how to speak about his experiences without shame, and taught his daughter, not by speeches but by example, that strength could look like asking for support. That dignity lived in kindness, and that resilience grew strongest when rooted in connection. And years later, when someone thanked him for his service and asked how he managed to come back whole, he would think not of uniforms or deployments, but of a quiet neighborhood, a waiting child, and a neighbor who chose the right words at the right time. And he would smile gently, knowing that his life changed not because the war ended, but because someone reminded him that he was allowed to rest, to belong, and to live fully again. And in that truth, he finally found his way home.